Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for some folks who may be joining us from the West Coast, and welcome to today's webinar titled What's New with RAD. My name is Tracy Newman, and I'm a senior manager with Quadel Consulting and Training, and I'll be moderating today's webcast. We're extremely pleased to have you join us today, and as we discuss the changes in HUD's RAD demonstration program resulting from publication of HUD's RAD Notice Revision 3, published in January 12th of this year. Before we get started, I want to take a couple of minutes up front just to discuss some basic housekeeping issues. First off, we're scheduled to run approximately 90 minutes, but depending on how long it takes to get through today's material, and depending on the number of questions we have, we may run a little bit longer than originally estimated. Due to the number of participants in today's webcast, we plan to address any questions at the end of the webinar. However, questions can be asked at any time throughout the webcast, but just keep in mind that we'll address these towards the end. This will allow us enough time to get through the material that we have prepared for today. Also, we will be recording today's webcast and can make the recording available to each of you joining today, and we can also post the recording on our websites upon conclusion of today's webcast. Copies of materials for today's presentation have been uploaded and are available to each of you to download from the GoToWebinar control panel at any time during our session. We've included a black line version of the RAD Revision 3 notice so you can view any of the changes made by HUD to the notice. We've also included a copy of the Federal Register notice authorizing an increase in the unit cap for Component 1 RAD transactions. And lastly, a PDF version of today's presentation materials prepared by Liz Bramlet. Just a reminder that all of you are joining today's webinar as a participant, and therefore all lines have been automatically placed on mute to help avoid any background noise, communications, or disruptions. As just mentioned a minute ago, questions may be submitted in real time throughout the webinar by clicking on the plus sign next to the questions dialog box in the GoToWebinar control panel located at the right of your screen. And this will expand the questions dialog box, which will allow you to type your questions and click send. We'll be monitoring the questions box and queue them up at the end of the webinar to help answer any questions that you may have. Also, questions at the end may be asked verbally by clicking on the hand icon in the GoToWebinar control box, and we'll do our best to kind of monitor that as well, which will unmute your line and allow you to ask your question verbally at the end of this afternoon's webinar. So introductions, we're pleased to have two very distinguished experts joining us today as panelists in our What's New with RAD webcast. In addition to myself, we have Denise Muha and Liz Bramlet joining us today. And Denise Muha is the Executive Director for the National Leased Housing Association in Washington, D.C., and will be providing us with an update from the Hill. And Liz Bramlet is President of Liz Bramlet Consulting and will be focusing on walking us through most of today's discussion on changes in the new RAD Revision 3 notice, again, published by HUD earlier in January of this year. Lastly, we also have Nick Murphy joining us, and Nick is a training manager for Quadel Consulting and Training, and he'll be helping me moderate today's session as well. With the completion of our introductions, I'll now turn the presentation over to Denise for some pending updates from the Hill, followed by an in-depth discussion from Liz Bramlet on revisions to the RAD 3 notice. Liz? Or, excuse me, I'm sorry, Denise.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here today to talk to you about RAD and what's going on in the Hill. And I want to say that I'm especially delighted to be working with Quadel and with Liz Bramlet. NLHA has long-term relationships with both and just top-notch training, and we're very honored to be a part of it. Just want to give you a little brief update what's going on in Capitol Hill, or what's not going on, I guess, depending what the case may be. But I think you may have heard that Congress did pass a continuing resolution, which basically means that they punted the fiscal year ends September 30 for FY17, and they did not do their job and get the bills completed for FY18. So the result is a continuing resolution, which basically funds the government at FY17 levels. Now that continuing resolution goes until December 8th, and which time we expect that Congress will likely pass a large funding bill. We call that an omnibus bill. And frankly, the House actually passed their 12 bills last week, and was a vote of 211 to 98, which will be the starting point for any discussions going forward with the major funding bill, which we crossing fingers will have a funding bill by mid-December. In relation to RAD, the pending appropriations bills that are in the Senate and the House, including the one that just passed the House floor, would raise the cap on RAD from 225,000 units to no cap. I don't know if you recall, but there was a 185,000 unit cap, and Congress raised it a couple years ago or last year. And initially the program was to be a pilot program, but by eliminating the cap, I think Congress is saying we think RAD works and we want to support it. The funding for both public housing operating and capital funds is increased or maintained, and there's additional funding for vouchers over 17 levels and a little bit more funding for PPRA. That's important because in the RAD program, as you know, the money that you get as part of the conversion comes from your public housing operating capital, and we need Section 8, of course, to continue to be able to support the conversion down the road. There's a couple of new things that are included in the bills which we expect to pass, and one would permit 202, Section 202s for the elderly that are PRAC properties, which is Project Rental Assistance Contracts under RAD 2. We'll be able to convert those, which is really important for those projects because otherwise they really don't have an option for refinancing or recapitalizing. Again, we expect that to pass. And also there's a provision that for RAD 2 conversions, which are generally the rent sup, wrap, mod rehab conversions, HUD has been limiting the rents to 110% of FMR generally, sometimes 120% of FMR, but in a few strong markets like Boston and New York, those rents aren't going to allow these deals to be done. And there's not that many left to do. A lot of the conversions have already been done under RAD 2, but this provision will allow some important preservation in those high market areas, so I expect that to happen. Of course, the hurricanes and other disasters that are still ongoing have been funded at least incrementally through December 8th, and HUD is very much really just inundated with the work that they need to do there. So you're probably not going to see a lot of things coming out in the next couple months other than hurricane related. And with that, I think we'll turn it over to Liz.
Fantastic. Denise, thank you very much for the informational update. And with that, we will now switch and allow Liz to become presenter for the remainder of this afternoon's webinar.
Okay, hit show screen. All right, and can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, is that okay?
We see your go to webinar screen. We don't see the presentation.
PowerPoint.
There we go.
Okay, terrific. All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is Liz Bramlet.
Muted.
Very happy to be here with both Quadel and NLHA. I was a trainer for Quadel many moons ago and have always enjoyed working with Denise and NLHA. So having said that, we want to go ahead and get started because we have a lot of material to cover. If we are not able to get to everybody's questions at the end, and I'm worried we might not be, I don't want you to worry about it because we are going to make sure you know that you can email us with any questions that you are not able to ask today or not able to get answers to today. So we want to make sure you get your questions answered either today or after today. But we do want to get through all the material. We want to get to all the changes that we possibly can so you walk away from this webinar with the best information and the most information that you possibly can. So let's get started. First of all, let's see, Tracy, I am not able to move the screen.
Let's see
When we
here.
practiced the other day, it worked just fine.
If you
And
select your mouse inside of the presentation, you should be able to advance it.
okay, let's see.
There you
we go. Okay, thank you.
You're very
Part
welcome.
one. Thank you very much. We are going to talk about the other notice that came out just very recently, the one that increases the public housing unit cap, the number of public housing units that can convert to long-term Section 8. Came out August 23rd, 2017 in the Federal Register. And in this notice, HUD increased the unit cap from what it had been for a while, 185,000, up to 225,000 units that can convert to long-term Section 8. And it said in the notice that HUD has to select properties through the competitive process that they've been using. They have to use their existing waiting list to select properties and the already established selection criteria. So everything that you already knew, or that what we're going to be talking about when it comes to how to get your property to be a priority to be selected for participation in RAD, that continues on. It's just 40,000 more units are going to be able to convert from public housing to long-term Section 8. And as Denise told us, hopefully in the near future, there will be no cap at all. Now, the RAD waiting list, they updated it for us. It's as of August 14th, and you can download the waiting list using clicking on waiting list here. And again, you have a PDF of today's presentation, and the link is included in the presentation, so you can click on that and download the waiting list if you are interested. And the notice told us that HUD can make RAD awards to projects to PHAs who before submitted letters of interest to reserve their place on the waiting list, as long as they have submitted a completed RAD application within 60 days of August 23rd, the day that the notice became effective. So you want to make sure you know where you are on the waiting list, and remember, have you only, before sent a letter of interest, and get that full application submitted in time so that you can actually be awarded a CHAP and convert through RAD. Now, for CHAPs issued beyond the 185,000 cap from before, and for any replacement awards made as a result of any revocations or withdrawals from the program that occur after May 5th, HUD will set Section 8 rent levels based on fiscal year 2016 funding levels for public housing. And they've already gone ahead and they have calculated everybody's 2016 rents for those who are going to convert based on 2016 funding levels. They've also made those available for download. So if you want to know what your initial contract rents will be, or rent to owner in the voucher program is going to be, you can download the 2016 rents and find yours, and you'll know what your starting point is going to be. HUD has begun to issue CHAPs for the first 40,000 units on the waiting list, where HUD has already received a completed application. And they are working to send individual letters and messages out to PHAs who are in the top 40,000 on the waiting list but have not yet submitted a full application, because they want to make sure they know they have a chance to go ahead and receive a CHAP at this point, but only if they get their completed application in on time. Now, after they select the first 40,000 units from the waiting list, they still have a waiting list of over 48,000. So there's still a lot of PHAs with projects out there that are waiting to convert. PHAs who have not yet applied and are interested in RAD, you still have the ability to apply through 2020. And you may submit letters of interest in lieu of your RAD application to reserve your position on the waiting list. And that's something good to know, because if you don't have the time now, or you haven't gathered all the information now to submit a complete application, you can go ahead and submit your letter of interest, and that holds your place on the waiting list. And so you want to be as high up on the waiting list as you can. So you want to take advantage of that opportunity to submit your letter of interest and hold your spot on the waiting list. Now, they gave us more information to help, in particular, we're talking about communicating with residents, because in the third revision of the RAD notice, they've greatly strengthened and expanded residents' rights and the owner's responsibilities to commit and share information with residents as you go through the conversion process. So they published some sample notices to help owners along. They published a sample resident information notice. It's called a RIN. We've known about that, what a RIN is, from the relocation notice that they have out for RAD. But now they have issued a sample resident information notice, calling it a RIN. That's supposed to be issued the same time that you issue the GIN, the General Information Notice, under URA requirements. And so this is a sample. Yours doesn't have to be exactly like it, but it's a good template. And obviously, since it's a template, you have to make some changes to make it appropriate for your project and for your residents. You must provide a RIN to all residents of a converting project prior to the first of the 2 meetings that you are now required to hold with your residents. You have to have 1 meeting before you submit your application and give residents the chance to see the application and what you're planning. And then you have to have a second meeting with them before you submit your financing plan to HUD, and you have to let the tenants comment on your financing plan, and you have to share those comments and your response to those comments with HUD. And so you want to make sure that you start that process off correctly by sharing the RIN notice to get everything going on track. Now, HUD has published also some revised RAD residential information sheets, which are designed to show the residents what RAD is about, how does it work, what are the important aspects of being able to convert from public housing to long-term Section 8, what that's going to do to the project, the condition of the project, and their living standards. And HUD recommends, strongly they recommend, that you provide these fact sheets, information sheets to the residents, and you do so no matter where you are in the conversion process. If you're already halfway through, they recommend you share these information sheets with everybody to keep the residents as well informed about the process as you can. Obviously, anytime there's this kind of big change at a project, the residents are going to be concerned. They worry they're going to be put out and not let back in. They worry that if they can't income qualify, that they won't be let back in. All kinds of concerns come up for them. Are they going to stay in their same unit? Are they going to stay in their same building? All of that. And so the resident information sheets are designed to help with that process. All righty. Let's talk about the big notice that we're really here to talk about today, at least that we were initially planning to talk about today, the updated RAD notice. Now, this is the 3rd revision of the RAD notice, came out in January of this year, and this is the notice, and it will remain the notice until we get a new notice. Either this is rescinded or HUD issues a new notice for the RAD program. HUD states that the changes from previous notices, the changes that we're making from previous notices, I listened to their webinar when they put theirs on, and they made it very clear that the changes they made came from their experience in implementing the demonstration program, where they seen problems, where they seen unnecessary complications, where they saw holes in the information and guidance they provided in the past. They've tried to address all of those issues in this latest version of the RAD notice. Now, Section 1 of the notice, it's like a 240-page notice. Section 1 is what we're going to focus on today, because Section 1 focuses on the first component of the RAD program, which is where public housing converts to long-term Section 8. The changes included in this part of the notice are effective for all conversions not yet closed. They say HUD will make some exceptions to that for projects that were close to closing when they issued this notice. Any changes to the eligibility and selection criteria that they issued became effective way back on February 21st. So now, this far into September, we know that all of the provisions, all of the changes in this revision of the RAD notice are effective for public housing converting over to long-term Section 8. Now, somebody might be asking, well, I remember when we could use the first component to also do our Section 8 mod conversions over to long-term Section 8. And that was true in the beginning. Section 8 mod rehab projects could select to either convert under Component 1 or Component 2. But now mod rehab conversions are all done under Component 2 of the RAD program. So we will not be talking about mod rehab conversions today. All right. Let's talk about some general program description and the changes in the program itself that we find in Section 1 of the RAD notice, the new RAD notice. Tracy and Denise and I, we discussed how we wanted to present the information, in what order we wanted to present the information, what we thought would be best for our audience today. And we have a large audience today we're very happy about. We decided that we would just go through the notice itself and just follow the same order as the notice, so that you could follow in the notice if you wanted to during the webinar, or you would know exactly where to find the information if you want to go back to the notice to refer back to it after today's webinar. So we're starting from the very top of the Section 1 of this notice and just follow directly to the end of that section. Okay, so in Section 1.2, HUD addresses civil rights requirements, and they provide a list of activities which owners must receive. Excuse me, I'm going to move something out of my way here so I can do better. Okay, no, I don't want to do that. I'm trying to get, Tracy, maybe you can help me. I'm new to this. How can I get the webinar box out of my way so it doesn't cover some of the some of the screen I'm looking at? It's
Sure. At the very top, Liz, you should see an orange arrow that you can just click on, and it should move that control box to the right out of your way.
It did. Thank you. That helped. Thank you very much. Okay.
You're very welcome.
Okay. In Section 1.2e, HUD addresses civil rights requirements, and they provide a pretty long list of activities where you need HUD's written approval before implementing them as part of a RAD conversion. And they added to that saying that HUD must approve a conversion where the project will serve a different population. So, for example, if you are converting a project, as you're going through the conversion, you've decided you want to convert it from a project that usually serves families to a project that is now going to serve elderly or the disabled. You need HUD's permission to do that, because that's a pretty big change with regards to civil rights issues. And they're certainly going to want an explanation as to why you're making such a significant change in the targeted use of this project, and they're going to want to know how is that going to impact the existing residents. Now, the RAD Fair Housing, Civil Rights, and Relocation checklist requires submission of information regarding conversions of assistance, and where the relocation will last at least 12 months. They want to know what you're going to do with the residents. 12 months is always a red line when you're talking about relocation issues, because it's when somebody is temporarily relocated and it goes longer than 12 months under the URA, they are entitled to receive URA relocation assistance. So they want information regarding that. and conversions of assistance involving new construction or substantial alterations, as these terms are defined in Section 504. So if you're looking at the changes you're making physically, and under Section 504, they would constitute substantial alteration. They will want information on that, how you're going to implement it, how it is going to impact the residents at your project. When it comes to eligibility, what changes do we have to talk about? They made some changes regarding HOPE 6 projects in Section 1.3H. We've known that projects with a date of funding availability, what was called a DOFA in HOPE 6 projects, of greater than 10 years prior to the RAD application, could convert through RAD. Now, where a HOPE 6 project was developed in phases on a continuous site, each of the phases may have a distinct DOFA. But for purposes of the RAD program, the earliest DOFA shall apply. So what that means in simpler terms is when the when the first DOFA is more than 10 years old, then the entire project can participate in a RAD conversion. And that should make RAD possible for more HOPE 6 projects out there. Now, owners of HOPE 6 projects that would be the final public housing units in their portfolio may also apply for a RAD conversion. So when a HOPE 6 project is all there is left in a PHA's public housing operation, all other public housing has become, say, is converting through RAD or is lost for some other reason. If it's the last project, they can go ahead and apply to convert through RAD, even if it has not been more than 10 years since the date of their DOFA. Again, that should enable more HOPE 6 projects to convert through RAD. Now, there is a CNA e-tool that HUD is developing, and it's supposed to be standardized, and they eventually, once it is out, it will be required for all RAD conversions. When it is out, it must be part of any RAD financing plan. You have to submit your financing plan after you received your CHAP and have accepted your CHAP from HUD. And it must be part of that financing plan and submitted 6 months after, it must be part of any RAD financing plan submitted 6 months after HUD publishes the e-tool. So in other words, if you're in the middle of developing your financing plan and you're just about ready to submit it when the e-tool comes out, they don't expect you to go back and use the e-tool. But if it's been 6 months since the e-tool was published by HUD, you have to make it part of the financing plan you're submitting to HUD. Now, any CNA submitted prior to this date, CNA is a comprehensive needs assessment, any CNA submitted prior to this date must use either the CNA e-tool if it has become available, or you have to follow the guidance under revision 1 of this notice with regards to what you have to submit to HUD as part of your financing plan. Now, HUD may exempt some transaction types from CNA requirements, with the exception of preparing the 20-year reserve schedule and the utility consumption baseline. Now, who can receive one of these exemptions? Projects that will be financed with low-income housing tax credits, and I suspect that's because most HFAs, their allocating staff require similar information in a LIHTC application. Projects where the total assisted units, in other words, RAD units and other PVV units at the project, will constitute less than 20% of the total units at the project. So if less than 20% of your units are going to be assisted after the RAD conversion, then you are exempt from this requirement. And HUD, on a case-by-case basis, may approve an exemption for a project whose the percentage of their assisted units are just slightly higher than 20%. But again, that's on a case-by-case basis. No utility consumption baseline analysis is necessary for buildings being demolished or being removed from the assisted inventory. So if you're demolishing a building as part of the conversion process, no need for consumption baseline analysis there. Now, utility consumption baseline requirements for new construction will apply in accordance with PBRA and PVV requirements. So whatever those programs ordinarily require when it comes to a baseline, when a project is going to be new construction, that is the baseline requirement for your RAD conversion when it comes to the baseline requirements for new construction. So you're going to be looking to PBRA and PBV for guidance as to how you would provide that information. And all proposed exemptions from this requirement has to be confirmed through your transaction manager. And I think this is a really important point. A lot of the clients that I have been working with on RAD issues, a lot of times we're coming to a point on an issue where we can't find an answer. As much information as there is out there now on RAD, and certainly we have a lot more now than we did several years ago, we don't have an answer to every single question. And usually that means we need to go back to the transaction manager. So everybody needs to become comfortable working with their transaction manager. There are so many times where issues come up where only the transaction manager can help us and tell us what to do or give us guidance. So do become comfortable working with your transaction manager. I have some clients who they didn't even know who their transaction manager was, and we definitely want to avoid that situation. Now, in section 1.4A2, HUD addresses green building standards, and they have standards for both new construction and rehab. And there's a whole lot of detail in there about what those standards are and how they apply in new construction versus rehab. We could spend all afternoon just walking through the detail for green building and energy efficient issues. So instead of spending that much time, because we have such limited time today, I definitely recommend that anybody who is involved in developing a construction plan for a RAD conversion, be it new construction or rehab, that they go to this section and become thoroughly familiar with it, because they need to understand how they need to incorporate those standards into the construction plan for the project. Now, all RAD applications must include a completed environmental review, which are done under either Part 50 or Part 58, depending upon how the project is financed. HUD will not approve any financing plan or any RAD conversion commitment for any owner that has not submitted an environmental review, and the standards for that environmental review are spelled out in attachment 1A of the RAD notice. So again, anybody who's involved in the construction and particularly involved in obtaining environmental reviews for their project need to make sure they go to attachment 1A and become very familiar with the standards that need to be met for the review to be considered complete if you want your RAD conversion to be approved. Now, we want to talk a bit about substantial conversion of assistance. In section 1.4.8.4, HUD states that a PHA may not reduce the number of ACC units at a project unless they have received approval from a section 18 demolition or disposition from the Special Application Center, what we refer to as the SAC. The PHA must submit within their PIC approval application information explaining why they are proposing the reduction in the number of units and include a description of the units to be removed. So they want to know, are these 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms? What kind of condition are they in? How do they fit into the overall plan for this RAD conversion? Why are you reducing this number of units as part of the RAD conversion? The PHA must explain why the project meets the criteria to be excluded from the requirement that they not reduce the number of units through the RAD conversion. Because the general requirement is you cannot reduce the number of units other than by a minimal amount. They call it de minimis amount. And if you're wanting to reduce the number of units more than that, you need to explain why you want to reduce the number of units. Why is this good for the project? Why is this good for the tenants? Why is this good for the mission overall of the RAD program? And it, again, goes back to that transaction manager. They will approve the reduction of units by project or portfolio. And you're going to have to be able to prove to them why they should approve this, because they got to answer why it is they're approving a reduced number of units when affordable housing is so necessary and so needed in this country. Now, any property or proceeds received from the sale of any property under the de minimis exception, as it's referred to, must be used for affordable housing purposes. And this is a point they stressed several occasions throughout the revised notice, that if, as part of the conversion process, the PHA receives money back in excess of what they're selling, if they receive money back that is in excess of what they're selling or what they're giving up, that they can receive it, they can take it, but it can't be just used for anything they want it to use for. They have to put it in an approved account, a HUD approved account, and they have to commit to using it for affordable housing purposes. And in the definitions for the third notice, they have revised the definition of what is affordable housing and what is an affordable housing purpose. So if you're going to be getting money out of the deal and you're going to put it inside in this account, you can look to that definition to see, okay, what is considered an affordable housing purpose? How can I use this money towards the PHA's mission going forward? Relocation requirements. Always remember that when we come to relocation, we talk about it in our main RAD notice, but we have a separate relocation notice, specifically talking about relocation and civil rights. And anytime the two notices conflict with each other on a particular issue, when we're talking about relocation, the relocation notice always rules. And we have last year in 2016, they issued a second relocation notice, updating the one they issued, I think, back in 2014. So if you are going to be doing relocation, and if you're a relocation manager, you want to make sure you've read and become very familiar with that second relocation notice, everything it says, because I think of the relocation requirements for the RAD program as the URA on steroids, because many of us are used to having to comply with Uniform Relocation Act when it comes to managing relocation for affordable housing properties. But under RAD, they've super protected the tenants way beyond what the URA does. And so you want to make sure you are familiar with that notice if you are doing relocation. Now, in the main RAD notice, HUD addresses fair housing, civil rights, and resident relocation issues. And again, it's PIH Notice 2016-17, where HUD issued updated guidance specifically on relocation in RAD. And in the attachments to that notice, they provide guidance on what should be included in a relocation plan, including resident notices. So I would definitely take a good look at that plan if you're responsible for relocation. It does give you a lot of good guidance for how to plan relocation at a RAD conversion. Now, the notice states that all residents being temporarily relocated must be allowed to return to the covered project. But interestingly, it does not say it must be to the same unit or the same size unit. It just says to the covered project. And I can tell you from experience that you want to be careful in all your communication with residents, that you do not guarantee them a return to the same unit if that is not what's going to happen. Because if you tell them it's going to be the same unit and then you're planning to relocate them to another unit, you can get into some serious legal issues with the resident. So if they're only going to be returning to the same project, make sure you say the same project And that way, if they end up in a different building, a different floor, something like that, you haven't told them you're going to do anything for them that you're not really going to be able to do. And HUD, throughout this notice and in the relocation notice, HUD encourages owners to right-size their units as part of their relocation plan. So when you have residents that you know are either underhoused or overhoused, they want you to address that in your relocation plan, and that definitely means people will not be returning to the same unit. So you want to be careful about what you tell your residents you're going to be able to do for them. Keep in mind, at a RAD project, there is no such thing as involuntary permanent relocation of a resident. Relocation planners, again, want to make sure you read the relocation notice, and you want to understand how you're supposed to deal with residents who will be relocated temporarily, but more than 1 year. Because again, when somebody is relocated for more than 1 year, you're supposed to ask them, would they like to be permanent relocated? You can't force it. But if they would like to be permanent relocated once you cross that 1 year line, then they become eligible for all the assistance that's required under the URA. Also, they reminded us in a situation where we're doing a RAD conversion that residents are not eligible for tenant protection vouchers. I mean, you think about it, that makes sense, because when you're going through a RAD conversion, the residents are going to be converting to long-term project-based Section 8. That's the whole point of the program. So there would be no reason to give them individual vouchers if they're going to be eligible to receive long-term project-based Section 8. Now, you may have other tenants at the property who have individual vouchers, and that's fine, of course. But just because they're going through a RAD conversion, that's not one of the triggers that provides the residents automatically with tenant protection vouchers. And I know that's a question that has come up several times. Now, we need to speak a bit about accessibility requirements. They address it in 1.4A6 of the notice. Most covered projects, they remind us, are governed by more than one law that addresses accessibility issues. You can be covered by the Civil Rights Act, the American with Disabilities Act, Section 504, the Fair Housing Act. There's, multiple laws these days that address accessibility requirements, and even more when we're talking about affordable housing than we're just talking about market rate housing. And HUD reminds us that when you are covered by multiple laws governing accessibility, you have to comply with all of them. So if say you're covered by 3 different laws, and one of them requires you to do something that nobody else requires you to do, you got to do it, and you have to do everything else all the other laws require you to do. So again, you want to have a checklist. Anybody who's involved in planning the construction, who's dealing with accessibility issues from the construction side, you want to make sure that they understand they've got multiple laws to comply with, and they got a checklist to make sure they're going to hit all of the requirements as part of the RAD conversion. Now, in 148A7, HUD addresses site selection and neighborhood standards. And they make it clear in this revised notice that PHA must certify with the submission of its annual plan, a significant amendment to its annual plan, or moving to work plan, that it complies with all the applicable standards when it comes to site requirements. And HUD will conduct a front-end civil rights review of the PHA proposed site in some cases. So if you're doing the kind of RAD conversion that it looks like, neighborhood selection could be an issue. A lot of times it won't be, but in some cases it will be. And if that is the case, HUD will elect to do a front-end civil rights review to make sure that everybody's civil rights are being protected through this particular RAD conversion. Now, when it comes to demolition, they address it in 14A9 and want to make sure we all understand that unless approved in writing by HUD, a PHA may not demolish or dispose of units until after the closing of the construction financing for the project. They don't want you tearing down units, getting rid of units until it's official that you have permission to do it and you have the financing in place to make it happen. Both the demolition action and new construction or rehab, either on-site or off, are considered part of a single environmental review. So you want to make sure all of that, what related to demolition, is included in the environmental review process so that it's part of the report that's generated and you've met the appropriate RAD standards. Now, Section 18, Demolition and Disposition for Public Housing, does not apply to RAD conversions and is not required when conversions include demolition. So you don't have to get approval under Section 18 to do demolition under a RAD conversion. You have to have approval under the RAD program to do demolition as part of your RAD conversion. Demolition approval pursuant to Section 18 is not sufficient to permit demolition of units under RAD. So just because you have Section 18 approval to do demolition, don't assume you're automatically going to get approval under RAD, because that is just not how it happens. Now, when it comes to ownership and control, they address it in 1.4A11. And as we know from the beginning, HUD has said that they want RAD, these public housing units that are converting to long-term Section 8, they want them to be owned by a public housing, the PHA, or a nonprofit entity. They give exceptions to that when a project is going to have tax credit financing. They give more specifics in this notice about how the ownership has to be structured in order to meet RAD standards. They provide a lot of detailed guidance on how the ownership has to be structured. Usually there's an attorney involved, in my experience, in structuring the ownership to make sure it meets HUD standards for a RAD project. Because just because a PHA is going to own it, there can be other partners involved in the project. When it comes to low-income housing tax credit projects, the ownership structures can be very convoluted. This is very difficult to understand in many cases. And so you have an attorney involved who goes through the process of developing the ownership structure to make sure it serves the purpose of the RAD program, and also the tax credit investors, the general partner. The general partner might be a PHA, or most likely a sub-entity of the PHA. And so you want to make sure that the person who is the attorney who is setting up your ownership structure reads this guidance in the RAD notice and understands what the ownership needs to look like. In 1.4A12, HUD addresses transfer of assistance. HUD will assess that the transfer does not place housing in neighborhoods with highly concentrated poverty based on the criteria formulated for transfers. So there's a lot of information in the RAD notice about how the criteria HUD uses when they look at a neighborhood to see, is it a neighborhood where you already have concentrated poverty? And is this a neighborhood where we want to transfer assistance from an existing public housing project to a separate project as part of a RAD conversion? And there's a lot of detail and a lot of expanded guidance in the notice as to HUD looks at this issue. And it's not important for all projects, but it is important for projects where you are planning to transfer assistance to a separate project. So if that is your case, you can find a copy of the criteria. It's available on their RAD site, and it's also in this notice under this section 1.4A12. So again, we won't go through all the detail. It would take too long. But for those of you who that's an important issue, make sure you get a hold of what this criteria is that HUD applies. Now, at a minimum, projects that are located in neighborhoods that meet these criteria will meet the requirement under this notice that transfers not occur to neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. So if you look at this section in the notice, and if the project you're planning to transfer assistance to falls under the criteria, specifically in this notice, you have a good chance that HUD will approve it. And they've said clearly that HUD may change this criteria from time to time. You look to the RAD page listed here for you for more information. Make sure you sign up for HUD's RAD Blast, where they share new information with us. It's a very good way to keep up to date. And listen for information coming out, watch for information coming out when this criteria might be changed. Now, unless otherwise approved by HUD, a PHA transfer units from a public housing project to an existing tax credit project within its 15-year compliance period only if the transfer is necessary to help with deconcentration of poverty and or the de-densification of public housing units. So if you want to transfer assistance to a tax credit project, but it's still within its 15-year compliance period for tax credit purposes, this is important for you. And HUD provides very detailed guidance for owners who are transferring assistance at conversion and for those who will apply for transfer at a later date. You want to make sure you look at this section in the RAD notice, again, if you're planning to transfer assistance to a new project. If you're not planning to transfer assistance to a new project, it's not of importance to you. Now, owners planning to transfer assistance, again, must read this section of the notice. And again, we're not going to cover all the details today. Either Tracy or Denise or myself will be happy to discuss these issues with you after the webinar. Now, Section 1.4A14 addresses compliance with Section 3 of the HUD Act of 1968, way back when HUD was created. And when we're talking about RAD, Section 3 applies to all work, including any new construction, not just rehab of the existing project, but any new construction that is identified in your financing plan and your RAD conversion commitment. It may apply to the project after conversion based on the financial plan assistance supporting the project. So you want to make sure you understand you have your Section 3 compliance issues to deal with and that they may extend post-conversion. When it comes to lead-based paint, they are not setting new standards for lead-based paint. They put this information into the notice specifically to remind PHAs and any other partners they may deal with that they do have lead-based paint requirements to deal with in general. PHAs are required to conduct a lead-based paint inspection and a lead risk assessment on a pre-1978 public housing property and conduct ongoing lead-based paint maintenance and periodic reevaluation for any lead-based paint hazards. Is the paint starting to chip around the door frame, around the windows when it wasn't chipping at your last inspection? What are you going to do about that chip paint? How are you going to get that paint to stop chipping and to enclose all of that so that the lead-based paint is not a hazard for the children living in that unit? Now, the PHA must provide any documentation available regarding lead-based paint and any lead-based paint hazards to the firm who is conducting your CNA and to any project ownership. And the owner needs to evaluate and control lead-based paint hazards pursuant to where you usually find your requirements at Part 35, Subpart H, including completing a risk assessment if the property will receive more than $5,000 per unit in rental assistance subsidy over a year. And again, these are not new requirements. These are requirements that were already out there for public housing units. They're just making sure you understand this is part of RAD as well. You don't get out from under these as part of the RAD program. The CNA must incorporate the work necessary to meet the project owner's requirements to treat the lead-based paint hazards under Subpart H. So again, make sure the firm who is doing your CNA, if you're working on a project that was built prior to 1978, which is a lot of public housing projects out there, make sure they understand you've got these lead-based paint requirements and that they have the details of what you need to meet to comply. All righty. Now, we want to talk about project conversion requirements and financing considerations. This is addressed in the notice in section 1.4b. And also, when you're looking for information in the notice, remember that you have the, there is a list of, and so including some new definitions that are important to understand with this program. And there is a pretty detailed table of contents. So when you're looking for information, that table of contents can go a long way to helping you find what you need. This is an important thing to say. HUD encourages PHAs who are inexperienced with current financing trends to hire a knowledgeable consultant to help them determine the best way to finance their project that's going to be converted. A lot of PHAs and you know, the executive director, the board, the finance department are experts in how to finance and how to use public housing funds to build projects, to finance projects, to operate projects. They've done some mixed finance projects. Some of them have done some Hope 6 projects. But if you've stayed in the public housing world up to this point, you might not have a lot of experience yet in how you use low-income housing tax credits, tax-exempt bonds, the home program, the new housing trust fund program, the CDBG program, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board's affordable housing program. There's all kinds of options out there that you just may not have worked at yet, but you can become an expert at those, just like you've been an expert at using public housing funds. So in your first round especially, they encourage you to work with somebody who's experienced at using these programs and benefit from their experience, because you can use that important to know, all loans secured by the covered project must be subordinate to the RAD use agreement. So when your different agreements are recorded in the public record, the RAD use agreement has to be in first place, and every other document that records a loan through the home program or tax-exempt bonds, or if you get an FHA insured mortgage or any of those mortgages you may have as part of your new project, all of those agreements have to be subordinate to the RAD use agreement. Now, for your financing, it has to be a fixed interest rate, not a variable rate mortgage, and must amortize over 40 years. It cannot have a balloon payment until after the earlier of the expiration of a HAP contract or 17 years from the date of the permanent debt financing. And you have to have a debt service not have a debt service coverage of less than 1.11 or meet lender requirements. So in other words, your net operating income needs to be at least 11% greater than what your mortgage payment is going to be, because they want to make sure they have some coverage, some protection from your NOI not being sufficient to meet your debt service requirements. And for projects that are going through are going to have low-income housing tax credits, usually HFAs require a higher debt service coverage, more like a mortgage insured through the 221D4 program, then that mortgage has to meet those standards. But those standards do not apply to any subordinate financing. And most of these projects two or three or four different kinds of debt supporting it. So if you have some soft debt through the home program or the Housing Trust Fund program or the Affordable Housing program, they often, that kind of debt usually is serviced with whatever cash flow is available at the end of the year, and or with a big balloon payment when you refinance. And so you won't have to meet those strict standards for this other debt but it's still going to be incorporated into the analysis that HUD will do when it comes to approving your financing plan for your project. They also talk about PH public housing funds in 14B2, because they want to talk about how you can use your public housing funds to help finance your RAD conversion. You may use Section 18 disposition proceeds if the use complies with Section 18 requirements. So if you have demolition as part of your RAD conversion, as long as it also complies with Section 18. Moving to work agencies, you have a lot of different options that the other agencies don't have. Moving to work agencies support the conversion, and you can use that as either a debt, which is going to have to be paid back, or equity that is invested into the project. Financing proceeds in excess of transaction costs will not be allowed when public housing, capital, operating, or moving work block grant funds are contributed. Now, when a public housing authority is converting all of its ACC units, they're converting their entire portfolio to the RAD program. Maybe not all as a portfolio, but they're converting all of their projects one way or another. Then there is no restriction on the amount of public housing funds that can be contributed to the covered project. Anymore, everything converting over to one form or another long-term project-based Section 8. So all of its capital funds and all of its operating funds can be used to support those projects through the conversion. All righty. That a public housing authority may bring into the RAD conversion project. I apologize for the typo there. I have Q instead of HUD. HUD addresses public housing debts and obligations in 1.4.B3. A PHA has to disclose in its applications they submit to HUD and in their financing plan the amount of project debt that's already associated with the converting project prior to conversion. And that includes energy performance contracts, capital fund financing, operating fund financing, public housing mortgage program debt. Any debt that is secured by this project needs to be explained how it is going to be dealt with in the project. About when we have low-income housing tax credits. RAD does not prohibit excess equity proceeds from being used to support other affordable housing purposes. So part of the investment that is contributed to the project, if part of that is excess equity that the project doesn't need, in a HUD-approved account, and it can be used, but only for affordable housing purposes as defined in the beginning of this notice. And they also want to remind most states, I would say where the ownership has to apply for a credit allocation under the state's qualified allocation plan. The QAP sets out how the state is going to rank or see how they need to structure. Very important to tax credit developers and to you if you are bringing tax credits in to your RAD conversion. And so under the QAP process to receive 9% credits, most states receive 3 to 4 times the number of applications that they can fund, and they want you to understand that, HUD does. And they also can provide affordable housing through the tax-exempt bond program, where if they issue tax-exempt bonds under what's called the volume cap, they can use those bonds to provide a tax-exempt interest rate to help finance a project. And that certainly is something that RAD conversions can utilize. And if they structure the project properly, when they get to tax-exempt bonds, the ownership and the project can also qualify for what are called 4% as a right credit. And so you'll have a private activity bond project with 4% credits, often referred to as a 4% bond deal. But many states do not use their entire volume cap to finance affordable housing. They can use it for other purposes, and many do. So they want to make sure owners understand that if they're planning on either kind of tax credits, they're facing a lot of competition, they're not being enough available for the demand in either case. So they need to find out in their area what they need to do to win an allocations of low-income housing tax credits and get into the whole tax credit industry, and certainly develop a strong relationship with the state housing finance agency and whoever is issuing private activity bonds for their area. Now, when it comes to grant funding, HUD reminds owners that there are numerous places to apply for grant funding, or what we talked about being soft debts, where the debt needs to be serviced usually through cash flow at the end of the year and maybe a big balloon payment when the project refinances. So when you're looking for additional funding, remember, you go through the CDBG program, the home program, the Housing Trust Fund program. All of those are federal programs, but are administered at the state and local level. And for those programs, you want to look at your state's consolidated plan, as where they lay out how they're going to use that funding. And you want to see how you can now use it in your RAD conversion. And then the AHP program, that's the Federal Home Loan Bank Board's program, and they spell out how they're going to use the resources. The member banks spell out, and it's always as part of their website, how they're going to use AHP funds to support affordable housing in their jurisdiction. So you want to become familiar with this. And also, a lot of states, counties, and cities have created their own programs to help support affordable housing. Many states have created their own housing trust fund programs before the federal government did. And they have also created risk-sharing programs, and they have created other kinds of loan programs where they can provide soft debt for these projects. So if you're looking to how to finance your RAD conversion, you definitely want to look to your state housing finance agency, your county agency, your city agency, to see what other funding sources you can identify that could help you support your RAD conversion. Now, in section 1.4b7, HUD addresses acquisition proceeds. For transactions involving the transfer of ownership to a new entity, a PHA is permitted to receive cash acquisition proceeds in excess of any seller take-back financing. And again, the proceeds must be used for affordable housing purposes as defined in the notice, and must be escrowed at closing or during any construction period associated with the RAD conversion. All right, let's talk about waivers, alternatives, and some other public housing requirements. Okay, in section 15A, HUD addresses using public housing programs to support the conversion. PHAs are permitted to use available public housing funding, including operating reserves, capital funds, replacement housing factor funds, demo and dispo transition funding in your development budget to support your conversion, and for rehab or new construction, and also to increase your initial contract rents. HUD provides a lot of new and detailed guidance in the notice on how you can utilize different public housing funds and towards what purpose you can use each specific type of funding. So you want to look at this section of the notice if you're planning to try to use any of your public housing funds to support your conversion in your financing plan. They address Section 18 applications in 1.5b. Now, Section 18, again, this is demo and dispo in public housing terms. Now, Section 18 applies only in these situations. The disposition of excess land, if a PHA proposed to reduce the number of assisted units by more than a de minimis amount, or where assistance is transferred from the converting project, and HUD has not approved the future use of the converting project site or sales proceeds as part of the RAD conversion. Otherwise, the PHA cannot have both a CHAP and an approval of a Section 18 application for the same public housing unit. A PHA, you may submit an application for both the RAD conversion and some Section 18 action for the same unit. And you may receive approval from both, but you can't use both. You have 90 days after receipt of the second approval to determine which you're going to use. Are you going to go through a RAD conversion, or are you going to use your Section 18 funding? And again, in this notice, HUD provides new, expanded, detailed guidance on the use of Section 18 funds. And if this, again, if this applies to you, you want to take a good look at that. Now, we want to talk about your 5-year plan. This does constitute, for PHAs, a significant amendment to both your annual and 5-year plan. And HUD, again, is providing, through this notice, new, expanded, detailed guidance on the requirements, how you have to update your plan as a result of the RAD conversion. And also, they address the consequences of not complying with the specific RAD provision. It can hold up the conversion if you have not met this requirement. It seems like one of those simple administrative things that isn't about construction or financing, but it is, HUD considers it important, and you do have to meet this provision if you're going to successfully do a RAD conversion. Now, moving to work agencies. If a moving to work agency chooses to convert assistance to PBRA, project-based rental assistance, and not PBV, then the covered projects will no longer be included as part of the PHA's moving to work program. So we want to understand that, because that is a difference, a significant difference for the agency when they're making their decision. Do they want to convert to PBV, or do they want to convert to PBRA? FAST, Public Housing Assessment System, very important to public housing authorities. You all know that better than I do. Now, HUD addresses FAS newly in this particular notice. It says, for a project with a CHAP to be excluded from FAS indicator scores, you must immediately, after the issuance of the CHAP, the PHA must submit an application in the PIC inventory remover module as either RAD conversion PBV or RAD conversion PBRA for all the units that are going to be covered by the CHAP. And you must submit the application by the end of that fiscal year if you want those units not to be included in your FAS scoring. And that's an important point, I'm sure, for a lot of PHAs. When it comes to lease conversions, public housing lease terminations, part of a RAD conversion, do not qualify as an adverse action, provided the tenants are provided with a notice of termination in accordance with HUD regs and information on when and how they will receive their new Section 8 lease, which, importantly, must be effective the same date the HAP contract becomes effective. And the typical grievance procedures requirements, they do not apply, because they have grievance procedures that they can follow when their public housing lease is being terminated, say, for cause. But here, it's not being terminated for cause because they did something wrong. It's being terminated because they're becoming Section 8 tenants. And so they don't follow those same grievance procedures, but you want to make sure that they receive all the information and all the notices we've discussed to let them know that they are they aren't getting kicked out. They're going to now just become part of the Section 8 program, which they should have already known about anyway through the notices you sent, and let them know when their new lease is going to be effective. All right. Tracy, can I ask you what time it is?
Yes, right now we are about 2:15, so we're running a little bit behind,
Okay.
but we can continue on, and in the event folks have to drop off, they can, but we can at least allow some time for questions.
Okay. All right. Let's talk specifically then about PVV conversions. HUD addresses PVV conversions in 1.6, and HUD has waived a limited number of PVV requirements to enable RAD conversions. They want to make it possible for owners to use PVV, and they try to get rid of the regulations that'll cause conflict. Anything that has not specifically been waived, you got to remember, that is part of the PVV program, you have to follow. So you only don't have to follow the PVV rules that HUD has specifically said don't apply to RAD conversions. Big news, covered projects do not count against the percentage limitation applicable to the PVV program. So when the PHA is monitoring how much of their voucher program is being committed to PVVs, the RAD projects do not count. Also, there's no cap on the number of units that may receive PVV assistance, and that is good for RAD conversions also. It is in compliance with HOTMA, the new act that was, I think it was earlier this year, that was passed by Congress. Now, covered projects shall have an initial HAP contract term of at least 15 years, but it can now be up to 20 years upon request of the project owner and with the approval of whatever agency. It could be the same agency that the RAD project came from, that who's ever going to administer that public PVV has to approve the extension of the contract term. Now, any HUD approval of a PHA's request post-conversion to reduce the number of assisted units is subject to conditions that HUD may impose, so we don't know what they are now, and is reviewed by HUD in the regular course of administering the PVV program. And moving to work agencies cannot change this particular requirement. So they're going to be sensitive to this whole issue of you wanting to change the number of units covered by your PVV RAD contract. Now, HUD's approval of a PHA's request post-conversion to reduce the number of assisted units is subject to condition. Oh, sorry, that's a duplicate slide. Let's not do that. Now, use agreements must say that if the HAP is removed due to breach, non-compliance, or insufficiency of appropriations, so it's either that the landlord has done something wrong or Congress has done something wrong, then for all units previously covered under the HAP, new tenants must have incomes at or below 80% of the AMI, and rents may not exceed 30% of 80% of the AMI for the appropriate size unit for the remainder of the term of the RAD use agreement. And it certainly requires compliance with all fair housing and civil rights requirements, including marketing under a federal affordable fair housing marketing plan. They have calculated your initial rents. HUD has done that for you. And so we talked about in the first part of this webinar how the number of units that can convert from public housing to potentially be a PVV was increased by 40,000, and that HUD has published those rents based on fiscal year 2016 funding. Now, any use of moving to work block grant funds and setting initial contract rents shall be subject to subsidy layering review and the moving to work continued service requirements. And there is no limit to the number of projects that a PHA may bundle, but it's important to know that the donor project cannot convert later than the recipient one. So if you're bundling rents, probably one project has higher rents, another project has lower rents, you're going to bring them to the same level. Then the project that is donating money to the other project has to convert no later than the date that the recipient project does. Now, initial contract rents cannot exceed the lower of the reasonable rent, the payment standard, or the rent requested by the owner. When rents will be adjusted annually through the application of the OCAF, the operating cost adjustment factor announced for the area. The rent to owner may not exceed the reasonable rent, but will never be lower than your initial rent. So that's like your initial rents are your rent floor, and moving to work agencies cannot alter that requirement. When work is occurring under RAD, HUD requires that all units meet HQS no later than the date of completion of the work as indicated by the RCC. So during construction, they are not required to meet HQS requirements. You may have floating units if you are not 100% assisted, and the HAP contract must specify the number and type of units in the project that are designated as RAD, including any accepted units. From the time of the initial execution of the RAD HAP contract, the property must maintain the same number and type of RAD units, including the same number and type of Section 504 accessible units. When work is occurring under RAD, another duplicate, I'm sorry about that. Now, residence rights, very important. There is a long discussion of residence rights in 1.6C when we're talking about PVV conversions. Since we're running short on time, I won't go through all of it. I definitely suggest you all go through it. And if you have any questions, anything you want to talk about after the webinar with any of us, Denise, Tracy, and I will be happy to help you with that, because there's a lot of information in the notice about residence rights, including earned income disregards and jobs plus. Folks, if they are part of those programs, when the conversion happens, if somebody is earning the earned income disregard when the conversion happens, they continue to be able to benefit from the earned income disregard. Nobody new can be put on the earned income disregard, however, after conversion occurs. Important, TTP exceeds the gross rent. They figure 30% of their adjusted income and exceeds the gross rent. For residents living in a converting project prior to conversion, whose rent exceeds the TTP, their units do remain under the HAP. The rent to owner for the unit will equal the lesser of the family's TTP, less the utility allowance, or the maximum tax credit rent. When the family's TTP, if it falls below the gross rent, then you go back to normal PVV rules for how you calculate their TTP and the HAP you're going to receive. All right, there's a lot of information here for you. I knew I would have too much, but there was just a lot of changes in the notice. There's a lot of information for PBRA conversions that we have not gotten to yet, and you want to make sure that you look at that. A lot of information on residence rights, and again, anything that we can help you with when it comes to PBRA conversions, any of us will be happy to help you along with that. Okay, I guess Tracy, we better spend at least a little time taking some questions, because I know we want to help as many people as we can.
Absolutely. We've been kind of monitoring the questions, and to date, we have responded to everything that has been submitted. So we'd like to take an opportunity here and just open up the floor for anyone who may have a question.
Good idea.
I don't see anything being submitted yet. Liz, should we just continue on with the application requirements section then? And
of course.
Folks, we're going to run a little bit over today, so feel free to hang in there with us if you want, or in the event that you need to jump off, then as Liz had indicated, we'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions following the conclusion of today's webinar. Okay.
All righty, let's talk about application requirements. HUD addresses application requirements and reminds people that all applicants must complete the Microsoft Excel-based RAD application on the RAD website and submit all other required submittals. Keep your environmental impacts in mind, and you can be assembling your environmental reviews and all of the reports that come with them during the application submission process. Those environmental reviews can take a while, and they hold a lot of people up. So reminding people you can go ahead and do those and get that work done while you're getting all the other information together. Again, you're encouraged to consider both 4% and 9% tax credits in your project financing. And to remind you again, because it's very important, that the demand for an allocation of 9% credits far exceeds the supply of those credits. And applicants proposing to use 9% credits, you need to either provide evidence that you already have a reservation of credits secured through your HFA, or if that has not been possible yet, you've done a self-score. You've scored your own project under the state's qualified allocation plan, are able to demonstrate that you are likely to receive an allocation under the state's next funding round. You may submit applications involving multi-phase redevelopment of projects. The project being converted can be either one contiguous site or a single AMP. PHA should note that for a single AMP, use of the multi-phase authority provides more time importance for completion of all phases than use of the portfolio authority. So you want to keep that in mind when you're thinking about multiple projects, which way is best for you, what timing is best for you when you're planning how you're going to do your project. When it comes to submitting applications, all required materials must be submitted electronically, not surprising these days, using a Microsoft Excel-based RAD application available at hud.gov/RAD. In addition to submitting the application as an Excel file, the executed attachments must be included as PDF files. No paper or fax submissions are permitted. Rejected applications will be notified, and the PHA may choose to resubmit. And if you do resubmit, you make corrections that they pointed out to you when they rejected your application originally. Your application will be reviewed in order of the date of resubmission, not the original submission date. So keep that in mind. Selection criteria. The third application period is where we are now. It began on 7/28/2015. For applications that meet all eligibility criteria during the third application period, HUD uses priority categories to issue CHAPs or to determine their placement on the waiting list. So how high you score will determine how high you score, and when you submit either an application or a letter of interest will determine where you are placed on the waiting list. And the priority categories in effect at the time of the issuance of the CHAP apply in each instance. Now, while a waiting list has formed, a PHA submitting a letter of interest to reserve their may submit a letter of interest to reserve their place on the waiting list. And you must clearly indicate with your application submission if the project meets any of the priority categories and must provide supporting information of that claim. And you can see there's a lot of detail. If you go to 92 of the notice, you will see what the priority categories are. Now, when it comes to if you meet the priority categories, what they've done through this third revision is they had 6 different categories before, and they streamlined it for us and for themselves. So now there are already only 2 categories. There are those that meet what they call high investment priorities, high investment projects, and then there's everybody else. So if you qualify under the list on page 92 of the notice that your project as you're proposing it would be a high investment project, that'll put you higher on the waiting list. Because first on the waiting list they put all the high investment projects by date, and then after that they list everybody else by date. And one important thing to keep in mind is if you submit a letter of interest to hold your place on the waiting list, and we'll get to your application later, one big consequence of that is that will not get you anywhere on the high priority part of the list. If you submit just a letter of interest, you are automatically somebody else, and so you're in the lower half of the waiting list. And even when you follow up with an application for a property that could be considered high investment, you are still everybody else and in the lower half of the list. So it's great you can submit your letter of interest to get on the waiting list, but know that there is this big consequence you will experience in exchange for that if you're giving up your right to be a high priority project, and can certainly impact when you receive your CHAP award. Now, for PBRA conversions, choice mobility, we know, has been part of the PBV program. We've never had choice mobility for PBRA conversions. You can't get a voucher to move under the PBRA program, but they wanted choice mobility to also apply to PBRA conversions when they are part of RAD. So HUD will allow good cause exemptions on a first-come, first-served basis for PBRA projects to be excluded from the choice mobility requirement.
Liz?
Now, yes.
Can I interject here quickly for a moment? Just wanted to bring to light, we do have a question from one of our participants wondering if there are any changes to the choice mobility requirements for either the PBRA conversion or PBV conversion, and also if the choice mobility applies for PBRA converted projects only to residents who are in place, PHA residents who were in place at time of conversion, or if that also applies to folks who later come onto the project after it has been converted.
Yeah, it's my understanding, and somebody can certainly correct me if I'm wrong. It's my understanding in PBRA conversions, it only applies to the tenants that were there at when conversion happened, and which is a good thing because we don't normally have choice mobility in PBRA. And I don't believe, I can't remember at this point, there are any big changes to the choice mobility program under PBV or PBRA. If I will be happy to answer that more specifically. If somebody wants to send me their email address, I'll check that for sure and get back to them. I'll go specifically to that point of the notice, but I don't remember any big changes in the program itself.
Right,
Tracy,
right.
do you remember some
no.
that I'm forgetting?
No, I didn't notice any big change under the Revision 3 notice applying to choice mobility. But we'll confirm that, and we'll get back to Val Christian. We'll get you a firm response to your answer here after our session is ended.
It is a big deal with PBRA conversions, that's for sure, since it's just not part of the PBRA world, ordinarily speaking.
Absolutely.
Okay, now a PHA may revise its application to certify that it will meet the choice mobility component and retain its place on the waiting list. What they're talking about here, if you've applied, if you're doing a PBRA conversion, and you are, and this might be considered a change you definitely want to take note of, is if you're doing a PBRA conversion and you said you want to receive part of the 10% exemption from having to do choice mobility, and so you're on the waiting list, but if HUD has already used up their 10% cap on being able to waive that requirement, then you will stay on the waiting list until HUD again has room under that cap to provide more exceptions. And so that could definitely, delay you receiving a CHAP award because they're waiting on being able to give you an exemption from choice mobility. So if that happens to you, you may revise your application to say you will go ahead and meet the choice mobility requirement, and that way you will retain your regular place on the waiting list and they will not skip over you if HUD does not have any room under its 10% exemption cap. That's important for a lot of PBRA owners to get that, because 10% is not that much for HUD to be able to give out under that exemption when you consider how large some of these PBRA projects are and how weird it is to have choice mobility in the PBRA world. So that's important for owners to get that. Okay, CHAP award and financing plan submission. Within 30 days of CHAP issuance, a PHA must confirm its acceptance of the CHAP by submitting an application, including required attachments, into the inventory removals module in PIC, identifying the units that will be removed from the public housing ACC when the conversion happens. The PHA is responsible for ensuring that upfront civil rights reviews and relocation activities are conducted as required under the RAD Relocation Notice. Now, HUD explains when an owner is responsible for submitting their plan based on when they receive their CHAP award. The dates vary, and so you want to take a look at this section in the notice. The dates vary based on the type of financing that the new ownership is going to be using and if the project is to include low-income housing tax credits. A PHA will be notified of HUD acceptance of your financing plan when they issue you an RCC, a RAD conversion RAD conversion commitment, conditioned upon you receiving firm commitment of financing on substantially the same terms you proposed in your financing plan. Now, the RCC sets the requirements of the transaction that will ultimately be included at closing. The number of units being converted, the HAP contract rents, the choice of PBRA or PBB, the financing terms, the sources of uses or your development budget, and any special conditions that must be cleared before closing must be included in the RCC. And the terms of the RCC survive the closing. So once you signed off on that RCC, you are committed to those terms. When it comes to the closing, draft closing documents, including those listed in the RCC and in any closing checklist provided by HUD, must be submitted to HUD for review prior to the closing. And you must use the forms required by HUD for the closing. The closing may not occur until all policy and legal issues are addressed to HUD's satisfaction. Now, beginning on page 98 of the notice, HUD lists the steps an owner must take to leave the public housing program and enter either the PBB or PBRA programs. And again, those HUD forms must be used. And let's see what else we got going here. Okay, the HAP contract will be effective on the first day of either of the 2 months following the closing at the owner's discretion. So the owner can choose to make the HAP contract effective either the first of the next month or the next month. And for the remainder of the first calendar year in which a HAP contract is effective, also referred to as the year of conversion, operating funds and capital funds will be obligated to the PHA at the level of public housing subsidy, which that project is eligible to receive regardless of what the initial rents are going to be. Now, HUD lays out in definitely expanded detail how an owner can use their operating and capital funds during the year of conversion. You definitely want to take a look at that. Now, for all repairs, included in the scope of work that's included in the RCC, you must submit to HUD instead of a cost certification. They're now calling it a completion certification, which will include a cost certification and any other information about compliance with all the requirements set out in your RCC. So now with this completion certification, you're showing that what all the costs are, like you would have in your cost certification, but you're also having to demonstrate compliance with any other requirements that are spelled out in your RCC. Remember, they said that the RCC survives the closing. So you have to meet all those requirements at closing per what the RCC requires. Now, I think this is interesting. Any management fees earned following conversion are not subject to any federal restrictions. And I think it's interesting from the PBRA world perspective because management fees are definitely regulated. There's a management agent handbook, I think it's 4381.5, but I'm not sure about that. That's an old number to try to remember. But definitely in the PBRA world, we are used to having management fees limited, and they're monitored by HUD or a contract administrator to make sure that management companies are not exceeding their allowed fees. But they are saying upon a RAD conversion that there is going to be no federal restriction. So I'm kind of be interesting to see what happens with that. Notice PIH 2016-23 provides information and guidance regarding program activities that PHAs must complete regarding removal of the last of their public housing dwelling units from their public housing inventory. So if you're converting all of your units and you're going, you're at the end of your public housing program, you want to make sure that you take a look at this notice and see everything you need to do. Now, the release of the developer fee will be made on the schedule proposed by the PHA and accepted by HUD in the financing plan. It used to be HUD said when the developer fee could be released, but now it's based on what the PHA proposes in the financing plan, and that's with the understanding that many of these projects will have low-income housing tax credits, and the developer fee is usually spelled out in the partnership agreement, and it spells out what the developer has to do in order to earn part of their developer fee, because they're basically being paid a developer fee by the partnership. And in many of these cases, too, the developer fee will be limited by the tax credit allocating agencies, or if they have other funding, home or housing trust fund, something like that, there will also be a limit on the developer fee. Now, the undeferred portion of the developer fee may not, without HUD approval, exceed the greater of 50% of the total development costs, less acquisition payments made to the PHA, developer fee, and reserves, or the lesser of $1 million, or 15% of the TDC, without offset for acquisition payments made to the Public Housing Authority, undeferred developer fee, and reserves. Okay, we are at the end now of what we had planned for today. I know it's a lot of information in a short period of time, but we wanted to get you as much information as we possibly could and direct you to where you can find more detailed information than we had time for today. Again, we wanted you to walk away with the best information, most information that you possibly could. Tracy, do we have any other questions to answer before we close?
One that was just received, wondering where the participant would find more information on the unrestricted management fee that we referenced in our presentation. The participant indicated that her RAD deals have required 9839-Bs and HUD sign-off on management fees. So I'm wondering if you have any reference to that, Liz, or maybe that's something we need to follow up on and get back to her.
Yeah, I know it's just a very short. I don't remember the citation off the top of my head. I don't think I have it in here, but it's just a very short paragraph in the notice, and it's towards the end of the notice where they talk about issues like management fees, and it says, and because it jumped out at me, that it said that there would be no federal limitations on it. So we can email you back that specific paragraph in the notice. You're not going to get a lot from it, but you could show your transaction manager this particular paragraph in the notice and see how that can help you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, well, I guess at this point, as Liz had indicated, we've covered quite a bit of information today in a relatively short period of time. We know it's a lot of information to digest, and we apologize for running over a little bit today. But I'd personally like to thank you, Liz, both you and Denise, for providing us with such informational updates and revisions to the RAD notice. So we'll take a couple of more minutes here and see if we receive any last-minute questions. And if not, we'll close the webinar out and follow up with these two pending questions independently after the webinar ends.
Okay, if anybody wants to contact me to ask me any questions, You have my website there. You can contact me through my website. Also, my email address is just liz@lizbramletconsulting.com. And so just my website, and just add Liz instead of www. Tracy and Denise, do you want to make sure they know which email address they should submit questions to if they'd like to contact you?
Absolutely. You can send information to tnewman@quadel.com or info@quadel.com. We'll do everything in our power to research and get you the appropriate response to any questions that you have. I guess at this point, Denise, if you have anything further you want to add?
Just that my email address is dmuha@hudnlha.com, and happy to answer any questions or provide any information that you may need.
Fantastic. Well, I don't see any other pending questions being submitted right now, so I guess we'll go ahead and adjourn today's webinar. And thank you both very much again for all the information you provided and the updates. And thank you everyone in our audience for attending. You guys have a great afternoon, and we'll follow up with those 2 remaining questions offline.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you all very much.